Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Nine Inch Nails Retrospective, where my friend Luke and I cover the discography of industrial music's biggest and debatably best band. The last time you all saw us, we were joined by a guest to talk about The Fragile, which is kind of the end of the first official phase of the career of Trent Reznor. And now we are progressing into, I won't quite say uncharted waters, but there is definitely a before the Fragile and an after the Fragile when it comes to this band and specifically Trent. Where we left off beforehand was kind of a bit of a low point for Trent, even though The Fragile, a huge, highly experimental, highly indulgent record that did have its detractors, but still was received mostly positively and somehow managed to still land on the charts. That still didn't mean that everything was going super great. Trent's continued
Yeah.
addiction with heroin, various other drugs, and alcohol was at its all-time worst. And at the end, we did mention beforehand, Trent actually did have an overdose on the Fragile 2.0 tour, which is kind of the focal point for which everything is going to be built upon from here on out. Because after this, Trent just kind of says, all right, we're having a fresh break. He gets clean. He gets really in shape, like really, really in shape.
He
Kind of
gets
has a
dad moded.
I mean, honestly, like he comes out onto stage in this era. If you see videos of this guy in the review, the Pitchfork review for The Fragile, they very humorously compare what he looked like to Phil Hartman's Frankenstein character on SNL, which I'm sorry, is still
Uh,
very funny. Even now, still a little funny. But you go back and look at that Trent Reznor and this Trent Reznor that's on with teeth basically a couple years in the future. It looks like two completely different people. It looks like the second Trent Reznor ate the first one or put inside him like a Matryoshka doll. And so we're having a bit of an overhaul. There is a lot of internal stuff that is going on. And Nine Inch Nails for a little while was kind of up in the air just because Trent wasn't even sure if he was going to be able to continue making music and even kind of had some trouble with some people who were involved with Nothing Records. There was lots of record politicking and stuff that was going on. So it was really strange. And, again, we're moving into the new century at this point. And now that we have the band's critical heyday behind them, we kind of move into a place of the discography that is a bit more uncharted. I would think it's kind of fair to say that the golden era of what people view as, Nine Inch Nails' best records is now technically behind them. And I don't mean to indicate that there's nothing to look forward to or that we're not going to be positive about this record or records from here on out, because that is absolutely 100% not the case at all. But I think that there is definitely a lot of people who literally just only listen to Nine Inch Nails pre-2000s work. You go and read reviews for newer stuff, and it may be successful, it may be mostly critically revered, but there is a notable drop off of the genuine sensation that this band was, and that was kind of presaged by a couple people breaking away from the stranger diversions of the Fragile. And you know what, I kind of get it. Like in the late 90s, when everything is going through this sea change of going from something that's strictly super anti-commercial that was born in stuff like grunge to the end of the decade where we're kind of letting the high of the early parts of the decade fade, and now we're kind of coming back down to earth and everybody's a little bit more grounded. There is a distinct different tone in the air, I guess now. And now we are In a place that I think is fair to say, I knew a lot of people just did not like an album like With Teeth, which is what we're going to primarily be talking about right now, because the perception of this is that this is when Nine Inch Nails goes commercial, which I only briefly wanted to talk about because like
Uh,
in many respects, this statement is both incredibly correct and also deeply incorrect. Because, yeah, we're seeing Trent go into a new phase where the experimentation, the weirder, wilder stuff, it's being de-emphasized consciously on his behalf. He is kind of taking himself a little bit more seriously as a curator of experiences. There is no longer going to be albums with as huge, grand concepts as something like the downward spiral, and nothing as immediately challenging. And so the people who came from those first couple of records and projects who valued that, some of them are going to drop off a little bit. But at the same time, the biggest chart successes of Nine Inch Nails as a band are mostly behind them now. So, like, I guess I just want to say, like, how exactly do you perceive the change that we're going through here? Because we still have some
hmm.
details to get to on the road to With Teeth. But generally speaking, I find it very curious examining all of this in retrospect because you go and listen to With Teeth, and it's definitely a different phase of all of this, to be sure. But it also kind of feels like people are overemphasizing the amount to which Trent actually changed and the amount to which With Teeth is a more commercial record. Because again, this is a statement that I think is true, but also kind of grossly exaggerates what the album is actually doing.
Yeah, I think of it as it's a weird thing because I agree with you because in a lot of semblances the run from, Pretty Hate Machine to Fragile is kind of like Berserker Golden Age, but with much better things to come afterwards as well. Um,
Yeah.
but with that being said, I think the one thing about With Teeth to me that I kind of gravitate towards is, and I say this as an absolute positive, to me, in accumulation, it is like the stereotypical Nine Inch Nails like album. It's like if you were like imagine a Nine Inch Nails album, it would probably be With Teeth in some way if it was like a little bit of everything. And it's like I think of it as the halfway point between everything that came before it and the sort of direction that kind of goes afterwards, where there is like the soundtrack work and a lot of the more bizarre stuff that kind of comes out later on in the career. So I think of this as it's like the black hole, like center kind of almost of everything sort of coming towards this one album in some way.
It's a baseline, and I feel like that's difficult to evaluate when it's happening in the moment, and only in retrospect can you really see where this fits into the chronology and discography and just kind of creative lineage of Trent Reznor. It's a strange thing to reckon with because I bet like if I were in the middle, if we were reviewing Nine Inch Nails albums as though they were new records and this was the newest one and we had to talk about it, I would be like, I enjoy this record, but at the same time, I'm not sure what this creatively means for Trent, and I'm not sure, like, it's just something that's hard to see without knowing where the road ahead goes. And that's because Trent himself didn't really know. After the overdose and everything that was going on, he did go into rehab and he did get completely sober. And funnily enough, we did kind of have a discussion about the song Hurt off of the Downward Spiral and how there's kind of been a conflicting schism about how the public at large views that song, in that there is a large swath of people who do not know that Trent Reznor wrote that song in the first place. Many people just think it is a Johnny Cash song because of the overwhelming success of that video, of that cover, and of that moment.
Also, I might add on to something because I don't know if we talked about this, and
Mm.
I'm really sorry to have to bring this up, but there is also the more recent sort of cultural impression of that song, which was used in the season finale of Rick and Morty.
Was it really?
Yes, yes, it was.
That's strange to me because honestly, I have been associating like when listening to the record for this, I associate every day is exactly the same as being linked to the animated television show Invincible because it's used in the season 3 finale of that show quite
Oh,
memorably and very well. So it's, that's actually an interesting thing is that we are seeing this band become commercial on a level we never thought possible. Because, like, again, think about a song like Hurt in the context of that record being used in Rick and Morty.
yeah.
What does that even mean? How does that even happen? It's what happens when somebody is a new creative innovator and basically becomes a new industry norm. And in like those sort of wayward years between records, Johnny Cash did cover Nine Inch Nails' "Hurt" and for his American series, very notably. And the funny thing about this is that this is one of the most interesting reactions of an artist's with their own music to me because the music video for this won a Grammy, the second version of Hurt, that is. And Reznor himself did not respond with, admonishing it or saying that he felt bad or that, it's a song that was deeply personal and has been kind of transformed or whatever, which frankly are all understandable ways to feel about it, depending on how you express that. But instead, Trent says, I pop in the video and wow, tears are welling, silence, goosebumps. I felt like I just lost my girlfriend because this song isn't mine anymore. It made me think about how powerful music is as a medium and an art form. I wrote some words and music in my bedroom as a way of staying sane about a bleak and desperate place I was in, totally isolated and alone. Somehow, that winds up reinterpreted by a music legend from a radically different era and genre and still retains sincerity and meaning, different, but every bit as pure. And I just want to afford Trent a little bit of grace for his take here because this is a very thoughtful and very nuanced take about something that, this is an album that is so deeply personal about something that's so difficult. I would imagine myself in Trent's shoes. I don't know if I would have as kind of a reaction to this because it feels like you could feel as though some part of you has been irreversibly altered in a way that is completely beyond your control. But instead, I feel like this does sort of show that Trent is a guy who thinks about, the artistic medium in ways that are both healthy and just kind of thoughtful in a way you don't often see. I don't necessarily think a lot of his industrial or heavy music contemporaries would be saying stuff like this. So
Yeah.
there is a long space between these last few albums. Like way longer than I think people really remember in their heads because again, this is the golden era of Nine Inch Nails, or at least it was. But there is a long time between Pretty Hate Machine and the Downward Spiral if you kind of issue Broken, and then the Downward Spiral and the Fragile have an even longer space in between them, and then that happens again with this record, which, I mean, understandably, considering everything that was going on, it's just kind of insane that Trent managed to hold on to that momentum, even though he wasn't constantly putting stuff out and constantly like, hey, I'm still here, because that's just kind of often what people have to do. So, with Teeth was something that was brewing for a little while. It came out in May 2005, even though it was actually leaked before it was officially released. This actually happened to a lot of huge, very notable albums around this specific time period with the kind of advent of the internet. And the album was mostly made in 2004, kind of following his struggles with his various addictions and substance abuses, and the legal battle with somebody we've mentioned before, John Malm Jr., who was somebody who was kind of like a business partner with Nothing Records and Trent. So a lot of the kind of anti-corporate sentiments and the personal struggles on something like The Fragile and on this record make a lot of sense in hindsight, honestly.
Yeah.
And with Teeth, despite its like lack of huge kind of like supernova hot status like the last couple of records, did manage to debut on top of the Billboard 200, which I think is notable because while The Fragile did get there, it also dropped from the Billboard Top 200 faster than anything he'd ever made. So there was kind of a
Mm.
bit of speculation in the air as to whether or not Trent was able to hold on to his audience. And With Teeth actually in its release was released in an interesting way in that like it didn't have traditional liner notes. It was actually released as like a PDF on the internet. And a lot of it
Hmm.
was released through a name that I'm sure a lot of you haven't heard in a long time, the band's MySpace page, which is something that a lot of people were doing and that a lot of artists were actually getting really big off the back of. Another band that's kind of in a similar alternative space as Trent Reznor is Radiohead, who eventually, a little bit later, are going to release something like In Rainbows, and that release model is going to prove very savvy for somebody like them. So Trent and just the alternative sphere kind of have their fingers on the pulse, which I think accounts for a lot of this band's success. And not to mention, this has some of the most single ready radio ish adjacent singles that
Oh
the
boy,
band
does
have
it
had
ever.
thus far. Oh, yeah. The one of the most kind of popular and just prevailing singles being The Hand That Feeds, which debuted on the Nine Inch Nails official website in 2005. And funnily enough, another kind of really savvy move on Trent's part, Reznor actually released the source files for this in GarageBand. And like a
Really?
month later, he
Oh.
like allowed and encouraged fans to remix the song and then did the same thing with the second single only as well. Including like the Pro Tools for everything that used to make the song. And this is eventually what led Trent to being involved with filmmaker extraordinaire and current Netflix slop mine master David Fincher, who directed the video for Only with a ton of weird CG shit. And there was actually a planned music video for the third single, Every Day is Exactly the Same, that was directed by another kind of current Hollywood. I wouldn't say he's a huge name, but he is making a lot of money right now, considering the stuff that he's tackling. That being Francis Lawrence, who did the Hunger Games
Oh.
movies, who did The Long Walk by Stephen King this year, who's I believe also doing the next couple Hunger Games movies. So this is basically how Trent has implanted himself into the world of film and cinema, which was already kind of happening just because Nine Inch Nails are this new, hot, cool, interesting band that a bunch of people want to use as needle drops and things. So, this being a very smart decision on everybody's part, and it kind of was the rising tide that raised all ships in the harbor, so to speak. And basically, this sort of brought Trent back, kind of re energized him. And this is what kicked off another tour for him, where he was supported by Queens of the Stone Age and I believe Death from Above 1979. And basically, there was also very strange. Another opening act on this tour was the hip hop artist Saul Williams, who performed on stage with Nine Inch Nails at the like Voodoo Music Experience Festival during a headlining appearance in a hurricane-stricken New Orleans, Reznor's former home. And the Nine Inch Nails live
Huh.
band completed a tour of North American amphitheaters in 2006, joined by Bauhaus and TV on the Radio. So this really is just kind of a who's who of the alternative music scene. But I do think it's kind of inarguable that despite the fact that he is such a, again, alternative, he's, adjacent to the pop music of the time, is that this is Nine Inch Nails' most commercial record thus far. It is not as loud, as blistering, as angry as something like Broken, nor does it have the structural and just strange kind of ambient sort of branching off points that something like The Fragile did. So now we're just in a place where we're like, okay, there's no driving concept, there's no huge big double album gimmick. What does a baseline Nine Inch Nails album look like now? And the answer is With Teeth, which, in terms of how I experienced this album, funnily enough, this was my first Nine Inch Nails album. As to
Hmm.
why, I have absolutely no idea. I remember upon meeting Morgan when I first started to grow my musical taste, I was aware of Nine Inch Nails and Trent Reznor because of movie soundtracks and stuff. And that was kind of where I was like, okay, I'm gonna start listening to Nine Inch Nails because they're cool and I want to be cool. And so I go and start listening to stuff. And I'm guessing that I just saw that Every Day is Exactly the Same was a popular song of theirs. And I liked the album cover of With Teeth. And I just
It is a cool
elected to
cover.
listen to it. And thus, I became a Nine Inch Nails fan mostly because of this record.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so not necessarily the record is how I first was introduced, but like a number of the singles on here are kind of like one of the songs on this album specifically literally was my first Nine Inch Nails song. Like I can visualize it and pinpoint the point in time in which I heard it, and we could talk about that when we get to the song specifically,
Mhm.
but that's kind of gives you a sense of why this album being a baseline is really great because it is like a great introductory point for a lot of people, I think.
I 100% agree. And the only thing I want to mention before we actually talk about the album proper is the fact that there was actually a live release in between these two records that came out that, if I'm being perfectly honest, is not incredible because, frankly, there are going to be a lot of really great Nine Inch Nails live works that I'll probably mention as they come up, and this is not one of my favorite of those. But it is notable because it kind of hid a secondary release on its second disc, that being what we now know as the Still EP, which essentially was born from the fact that Trent at some point performed very stripped back, borderline acoustic or just straight up acoustic versions of Nine Inch Nails songs and loved the way they sounded, and so just kind of did alternate takes and versions of these songs for this EP that was ultimately put onto this live album, which is also conversely why this album is so difficult to find information about. I actually had no idea
Hmm.
it was packaged with And All That Could Have Been, but it was why it was so difficult for me to find it when I tried to like collect the Nine Inch Nails discography when I started listening to them. So there is a lot of great renditions of previously existing Nine Inch Nails songs on there that we will probably talk about more in depth when we talk about the tertiary releases of the band in one big video. But that is something that, in retrospect, I think has gained a lot of acclaim. Like, that is a really big Nine Inch Nails fan favorite, I guess, is that these versions are now highly beloved, and this is a project that people would rank amongst some of the best releases from the band. So there was still a very vocal, very intense following for Trent's music that would still latch on to releases like this. So this is not to imply that this album, despite its commercial leanings and despite, some people being like, oh, Nine Inch Nails, they're not as cool and crazy as they were back when Trent did Heroin, which unfortunately was kind of a prevailing sentiment because people in the 2000s just kind of talked about artists that way. Can't be helped, I guess. But
Very
now,
thoughtful
of
times.
course, yeah, really. Now, of course, we have in front of us With Teeth. And difficult to know where to start other than the singles because they are such big, big. Like, these are ones that I forget are as big as they end up being. And personally, my favorite of these particular singles, expectedly, as I kind of mentioned, is the one that I experienced for the first time, which is Every Day is Exactly the Same, both because I think that this has just one of my absolute favorite sort of series of production flourishes. I love the way that the bass sounds on here and the drum pattern of not just the song, but the drum patterns across this entire album are kind of fucking crazy. Like, a lot of these songs have
Yeah.
really distinct trip hop leanings, really like leaning into the that one particular fringe aspect of, albums like The Fragile. So in that respect, we are still being a little weirder, a little more out there, but it is beneath a lot of very traditional Nine Inch Nails tropes. But I love the kind of immediate throttling intensity. I love the mournful piano note that starts out this song that is
Yeah,
scattered
love
across
that.
this entire record. Like, the piano is a key feature of With Teeth, in my opinion. And Every Day is Exactly the Same is just one of those really good classic songs that feels really earnest because you look at the lyrics and this is definitely a song about what it's like to kick addiction and what it's like to just view time itself as being this inescapable thing that just kind of has you trapped because you don't have the releases that you had before. You just have the march forward that feels so, so slow. And Trent's performance on here is both mournful, it has that kind of traditional angst in his voice, but I also just kind of feel like Trent on this record, his performances just feel a little bit more with it. Like, with The Fragile, it's kind of like that album is an album that plays Trent. And this is Trent playing the album, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like there is a bit more of a sense of control in terms of how the performance is played out in this. Like there's lots of vocal flourishes in this that like I think about. When we get to the titular track, there's one that I love that is I think is both very funny, but also I kind of do it myself now. I get what you mean though, where it's like this one is Trent actually playing the album. Like there is more of a like it's a very different presence. And also something that I want to note about this song is when I was younger, because this was one of those singles. This wasn't the first single that I heard from Nine Inch Nails, but it was one of the first. But when I was younger, every time he kept saying, like, I think that I used to have a purpose.
Purpose.
I thought he said porpoise. So
I I swear to God, Luke, I totally thought this when I was younger, just because he says it strangely. He says purpose. Like, he kind
porpoise.
of like goes up in pitch in the second syllable, and it sounds strange. And so you just imagine Trent with a porpoise.
I think I used to have a purpose. 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 I think I used to have a purpose.
Holding a dolphin that's like slowly
Man, I was a
floating away. I remembered
kid.
another one too, also. It was Tonight Tonight, Smashing Pumpkins. When he says indescribable, I always keep thinking he says, and you will scrub my balls.
Well, it's funny that we mentioned these guys because I find it interesting. They have such distinct vocal tonalities. Like, when you listen to the Smashing Pumpkins,
True.
that's a band where you're just like, the first thing you hear is Billy Corgan. Like, it doesn't matter what else is happening in the song. You're just like, who is this weird little gremlin man singing
Yeah,
at me. And you hear Trent on an album like this, who is in the same sphere as people like Billy Corgan. And in fact, Billy Corgan dropping Adore, which at that point, most of the members of the Smashing Pumpkins weren't really in the band, and that's borderline kind of a solo project. But like, you listen to Adore, and it's like, oh, Billy Corgan loves Nine Inch Nails. He loves Nine Inch Nails because this sounds
hmm,
just like Pretty Hate Machine. And you
damn.
hear him, and again, he's got that weird kind of raspy, snarly voice that's also just kind of high pitched and odd. And you hear Trent sing on this, and he always has had this voice, but it's never more apparent to me that Trent at least sounds like he's vocally classically trained on this album, because his performances, I mean, his voice is beautiful. We've talked about his
Very much
angsty
so.
delivery before, and with good reason. It's because it's everywhere. And previous records clearly had slower Nine Inch Nails moments where Trent was able to kind of flex his more just, baseline vocal tone. But on here, it really feels like soulful almost. Like there is a
Yeah,
distinct
actually.
dynamism that I feel like is, it kind of feels like when those moments happen on previous records, it's for a song or for a verse. But on these songs, it feels like Trent kind of emphasizes the dynamics a lot more and just sort of does this a couple of times on every single song. Like he'll have his strained and raspy kind of delivery on some parts, and then he'll
Yeah.
switch to the chorus, which will be more sung clean vocals. And it really does feel like he's trying to fill out the sound of the band at this point.
Yeah, I'd very much agree. There is just like a lot of not so much going for either absolute blast of adrenaline or just this like super barely audible kind of inflection. There is more of a filling it out in a way that like I mean, yeah, it's maybe more clean, but like it's a positive clean kind of, if that makes sense.
No, completely understand. It's that I would also say the same thing. And it's understandable why people would have a bit of an issue with this. And I'm about to use a word to describe Nine Inch Nails' sound that kind of lasts from here to, I mean, debatably hesitation marks, where the sound of Nine Inch Nails, and particularly the dynamics, they are more nuanced than they were before. And when I say nuanced, that is not inherently a positive thing. I just think that they are more considered. The previous music of Nine Inch Nails goes for bigger swings, bigger extremes, things that leap out to you more immediately. This, on the other hand, you feel Trent reining himself in. You feel the structures of these songs going from, like, you had songs on The Fragile that ranged from a minute and 50 seconds to 8.5 minutes long. This, on the other hand, is a pretty clean 55, 56 minute long record where every single song feels complete. There is no kind of moment on here where there is experimentation that diverges from the path. There is no moment on here where Trent will kind of throw you a southpaw or go for a left hook. And again, like, I would say that even Pretty Hate Machine, an album that, if I'm being honest, I have grown on that album a lot, but I do actually sort of prefer this record very slightly, mainly just on the strength of the songs themselves. But like on
Hmm.
Pretty Hate Machine, when Trent made a softer song, it's way more pronounced. Even the moments on this album that relent in terms of energy, particularly on stuff like All the Love in the World and You Know What You Are, the two opening tracks, I feel like this is a conscious attempt for Trent to just kind of scale things back, to include more variance in volume, in just the way that these songs sound and feel, even the distortion. Like we kind of talked about the trademark Nine Inch Nails torn paper, torn sheet metal guitar tone. It's not gone, but it is certainly put into these songs and applied in a way that makes it fit more. Like it sounds the same, but it does not contrast with the rest of the mix as brightly as it did before.
Yeah, like there like it is more uniform altogether in terms of how the sound is constructed. The way this is the way I see it sometimes is like sometimes you want to hear a type of fragile like a fragile type album that goes from the quietest of quietest to the absolute just like ear bleeding I'm going to die type levels of volume. But if you're like, dude, I have a migraine, then you listen to something like With Teeth.
This is what I want when I listen to a just kind of it's sort of one of my go-to Nine Inch Nails albums, if I'm being honest, just because a lot of these albums have a really solid baseline level of quality. Like, I don't think Nine Inch Nails have a bad record. I think they have albums that stand out to me far less and just kind of push against the boundaries in ways I find less interesting. But there is never a moment where I feel like Trent is not trying and where I feel like his hand is not very carefully and deftly sort of, involved in the experience. I always feel as though every Nine Inch Nails album, every Nine Inch Nails project, be they long or short, is the result of a lot of hard work. And that's not making excuses for lesser releases because if you ask me, with Teeth is simply not an album I would consider a lesser release. It is more conventional, it is more immediately understandable, but every artist needs a gateway album. And when you are someone like Trent Reznor and you make this weird off the wall experimental music and you're bouncing back from the fragile, finding your center and making something that's a little bit more inviting, like this is still so much heavier and so much denser and more distorted than any of the radio rock coming out around this time. Like any popular rock album in 2005, no fucking way a song as intense as The Hand That Feeds is making it onto there. It's just not happening. So I think that at
Nope.
the time, this suffered mostly by comparison, and it suffered mostly because of the weight of expectation and the uncertainty that surrounded Trent. Because when I listen to this album, it's the furthest thing from uncertain. I feel like somebody, everybody was in the room for this. And when you have two songs like All the Love in the World and You Know What You Are, these two songs are not my favorite Nine Inch Nails songs by a long shot, but they feel like they are an active attempt to be a little less forward, like, this is really intense and I'm going to just sort of like, Pretty Hate Machine, ba 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 ba. This is way more, I am going to create what I think is the Nine Inch Nails sound for everyone. And if you try to introduce this band to somebody, Pretty Hate Machine's not a bad place to start, but as we kind of went over with that record, there's some production flourishes on that album that are super dated. That is an album that came
Yeah.
out at the end of the 80s, and it sounds like it came out of the end of the 80s. However, after, Downward Spiral Forward, Trent's music is essentially ageless. Like, I don't detect sounds that I associate with time periods after Pretty Hate Machine. And this is no exception to
Yeah.
that. But at the same time, I really I understand why, if you wanted to recommend this to somebody, you can't really pick the downward spiral because who's to say if somebody really cares about the conceptual angle of albums, which I feel like you need to in order to get everything that that album provides to you. Like, if you're not somebody who wants to understand an artist or understand a concept album, then the downward spiral is just probably not for you. Like, there are songs from it you could probably use, and hell no, you're not going to recommend The Fragile as somebody's first Nine Inch Nails album. It's long as hell, it's way too fucking weird, and there's just too many moments on it that just aren't immediate. So, baseline, yeah, I almost think With Teeth has to be the album that you should recommend somebody listen to first. And I don't begrudge an artist for making something more accessible as long as they don't compromise. And listening to this album this week, I detect zero compromises here.
Same. I think of it as it is not sanding off the edges. It is just giving a more clarity to the picture, if that makes more sense. And it's interesting to me, like with some of the choices, there's still some interesting choices, I think, because when I think
Mhm.
of like a bass line, I think of something that like immediately like pulls you in. But this starts off with a song that I wouldn't describe in like the same way as other intro tracks for like other Nine Inch Nails songs that build up to this really like intense thing or just have a lot of build to begin with. This just kind of opens with this oddly nefarious plotting-esque kind of sounding track that is, very hushed, very quiet at first.
And All the Love in the World is such a curious song because this song to me is very blanketly about jealousy, like
Yeah.
petty jealousy. It is somebody looking at somebody else and envying their, maybe not necessarily their success, but it's just like looking
Their
at someone
notoriety.
you, yeah, like somebody you deem to be like not even like lesser, just because I feel like this is the point where Trent's about like lyrically nuanced enough to the point where I can kind of give him the benefit of the doubt. I know some people at the time did have some issues with the way that Trent Reznor writes and how this doesn't necessarily feel like a huge evolution from the previous records, which I do not agree with. I think that on face value, it's easy to mistake that. Like, you take a look at All the Love in the World, and you have the opening set of lyrics, watching all the insects march along, seem to know just right where they belong, smears off face reflecting in the chrome, hiding in the crowd, I'm all alone. These are lyrics that would fit perfectly on the downward spiral. Like, perfectly. You wouldn't even notice. But one thing I think is key about this record is that a lot of it feels like if we can get woke for a second, talk about pronouns, but in the actual linguistic sense of pronouns is that a lot of Trent's previous music before this, we're getting we're getting me, we're getting internal struggles. We are definitely getting that on here, as this is an album that is about addiction, for sure. But there is a lot more you. There is a lot more external forces. There is a lot more systemic forces. Things that Trent mainly touched on Pretty Hate Machine and grew away from as his personal problems kind of got more intense and got more focus in his music. And now it feels like we're kind of shifting the needle back and then going to the powers that be. This is like the most punk in spirit Nine Inch Nails album thus far. And it does feel kind of, you could read a lot of it as juvenile, but it's not necessarily in the text. It's about the perspective the text is written with, which I think is undeniably more nuanced on here because you really do get a kind of Trent feels like he's looking down at himself in third person. It's like a Slaughterhouse 5 kind of thing. It's a
Yeah.
very kind of top-down look at issues that are facing, American consumerism and, a lot of stuff about the American political landscape is on the fringes of this record and is really going to materialize and take shape on year zero on the next album that we go to after this, to the point where, like, that is blanketly and unapologetically about, the Bush administration and the Iraq War. Whereas this is a little bit more general and a little bit more vague, but like it's a stepping stone you have to take as an artist. I feel that this is an album that, again, it's nuanced, which that's not inherently good or bad, though I do think he does it well.
I think it should be addressed that this album did come out in a post 9 Inch 11 era, so now we are
That,
truly
you
in.
know what, Luke? I didn't even think about that, but you're completely right. There was definitely a sea change that I do feel like, even if it didn't explicitly inform you as a songwriter, it's going to kind of affect it subconsciously in some way. And on a song like All the Love in the World, I love how there's kind of an evolution in how Trent talks about the object of his jealousy, as it is very kind of petulant and envious at first, but the more it goes on, the more the title of the song feels like the focus, the sentiment of just like not necessarily jealousy, but it's like somebody you deem to be like evil or unworthy of what they've been given, and you see the things that they get, the things that, them being rewarded essentially. And I feel like it's not exactly a stretch to be like, this is probably either about politicians or the music industry or both, where, greed
Yeah.
is rewarded, where industry and financial incentives are rewarded over, the actual spirit of people. It becomes less petulant and becomes way more like not quite righteous just because it is rooted in a kind of juvenile perspective, but it still feels salient. You still kind of feel it and you're like,
Yeah.
I like that. Like there's a lot of lyrical moments, especially in kind of the center of the song. Colors all look brighter when you're near. The stars are all afire in the sky. Sometimes I
Mhm.
get so lonely I could dot dot dot. Good
Yeah.
little moment there.
I also think the thing that I think really sells like that what you're saying, where it's like maybe looking from an outsider perspective, the lyrics may seem sort of petulant, but there is something much more like meaningful behind it, is like just the overall tone of the instrumentals in it, because it's not like in a previous Nine Inch Nails song where it'd be really aggressive about, someone else getting the appreciation that is unwarranted. Whereas here there's almost like a creeping unease about that. Like it's not so much of a, oh, you got all love in the world. It's like, why are you getting? There's something's deeply wrong
it's
here.
an it's an earnest question rather than a, oh, why do you get it? It's like, no, why do evil people get rewarded in the world we live in? It's like
Mhm.
it is a sentiment that once it is kind of dissolved into its base form, you're like, I understand this now. And I feel like our reading of the song is only backed up by the fact that You Know What You Are comes after this, which is just a song about how much Trent fucking hates himself. Like, this is him
Yeah.
looking at himself and being like, you are a pathetic, weak piece of shit. Like, this is him working through some stuff that feels like real toxic. You're like, this is something that you only write when you are going through a long internal battle with yourself. He says that he's full of shit on here. With every bit of
Quite
my
literally.
heart, I have tried to believe in it. You can dress it all up, you can try to pretend, but you can't change anything in the end. And he's like, go on and get back where you belong. It's like he's admonishing himself for daring to ever think he could be more than what he is, which is just
Yeah.
like it feels incendiary. Like it almost feels uncomfortable. And I feel like the song relenting in like this is a relatively intense song, but the production still lets it breathe enough for you to kind of take it all in. This is still an easy song to digest.
Yeah, like it's kind of I think of it as a case of, if you're an introductory fan, you can kind of digest what the message is and not have it be sort of like lost in the production of it. With like something like Fragile, where it's you wouldn't even know what the fuck he's saying at certain points depending on what the song was. Whereas here, that's kind of what I mean with like the sort of clarity of the picture sort of thing going on here, where it's the style and the presentation is still there, but dialed back enough where it's the lyrics can kind of take more of a center stage in some areas rather than like the atmosphere necessarily. But that being said, there's still really good atmosphere.
Yeah, it's just sort of a, the atmosphere of the previous records feels like it's at like a 10, especially on an album like The Fragile, where it's like this feels honestly less like an album of songs and more a sonic experience, whereas this is very
Yeah,
much an album of songs. And
yeah,
there are moments on this album, don't get me wrong, where I'm not really as into what's going on as I am on the rest of the record. It's not a huge weakness, but this is kind of the moment where I do like my least favorite moments on this record and my favorite moments. There is kind of the biggest valley that there has been so far between those two, way more so than on the records that came before it. Namely, in
yeah,
just like probably my least favorite song, which isn't even a bad song on here, but the third song, The Collector, is very much stock Nine Inch Nails. Like this is a song that
yeah,
feels like it did come off of the Downward Spiral lyrically, kind of has been retrofitted with this sound, but it feels as though the lyrical nuance that we've been talking about is kind of a little bit more absent here. It feels a bit it's relatively more one-dimensional than the rest of the songs on here, particularly the songs that surround it, which kind of make the sequencing of this first half a little bit askew for me, just because you're surrounded by two really solid opening songs, and then The Hand That Feeds, Love Is Not Enough, and Every Day Is Exactly the Same in the title track, which I think is like one of the best runs of four songs that Nine Inch Nails have had thus far. So we're a little wonky here, but at the same time, something has to come in last place, and I don't dislike this song.
I'm going to consult my notes if I have anything of note to say. I'll definitely say this is when we are in full piano accents era of
Hmm.
Nine Inch Nails, because that was literally the only thing I put in. Is like I love the little piano at the end of the track.
There is something about the way Trent uses the piano all across the discography that feels hollow. Like, particularly
Mhm.
that opening little sort of note on Every Day Is Exactly the Same, that boom, boom, which you
Yeah.
hear that and it's like the ambient aspects of Nine Inch Nails are considerably toned down to the point where they're basically not really here on this record. But I hear that and I'm like, oh, that piano note, that's going to be the Social Network score. That's going to be the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo score. Like, that's
Yeah.
going to be the font for something that they're going to do later. And it does kind of fill out the body of this album's sound. And after The Collector, again, this run of songs, The Hand That Feeds, Rager. I love this song.
This this was the introductory song. Let me paint
Banger
a
intro.
picture. Let me paint a picture for you. You are 8 years old. Your brothers drive you to school every day of the week, and every single day they have what is the alternative rock station play on the radio called KFMA if you are from Tucson. And I once a like almost once a day without fail, The Hand That Feeds will play on that radio at some point. So, despite me not being someone who always paid attention to the radio, I always heard that song and I always remembered it. And then when listened to movie soundtracks and was like, oh, love Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, I wonder what like Nine Inch Nails is. And I play this one, it's like the hand song. They did the hand song.
That I mean, I find it difficult to imagine like if I was that age and heard this song, I don't know how I wouldn't be obsessed with it because it would have been the heaviest and most intense thing I had heard up until that point.
Well, if you want to know why I wasn't obsessed with it, is because the radio never gave me an indication as to who the fuck was playing the goddamn song.
Damn, pre-streaming era was wild.
I
That kind of weird liminal state in between the main method of music distribution that we were alive for is it was something else.
And I should add on to this story two other songs that constantly played on that radio station for some reason: Brass Monkey by the Beastie Boys
Okay.
and Because I Got High. I don't remember who made that song.
Because I got high.
Yeah,
Because
like
I got
literally, me and my brothers at one point heard it so many fucking times we could sing it in unison when it played.
high. If I heard that after a song from With Teeth, that's some of the biggest thematic whiplash I think that you're capable of experiencing at that age. And
Truly.
the hand that feeds is definitely like the most distorted and biggest kind of sounding song on here. It's a prototypical single choice for Trent, so completely understandable, but also very much emphasizes the lashing out against the powers that be. This is very much a song that is against the system, that is against kind of, rebelling. There's lots of kind of Orwellian imagery in here, but it really
Mhm.
succeeds on the merit of the fact that it is fucking intense and just kind of a whole lot of fun.
Yeah.
And you also have a moment like Love Is Not Enough, which I feel like brings forward a lot more of that nuance that we keep talking about, just because the title kind of says it all in that this is Trent reckoning with the fact that positivity, love, and sympathy are all great things. They cannot save you, though. These are all things that, if you find yourself as in the bottom of the hole that Trent was at, these things are nice, but they don't get you to quit being a heroin addict. So, like, this is very much a song of somebody who has gotten clean and just, is reckoning with the fact that all of these positive forces, they don't mean much unless you yourself actually take the initiative. And this is him reckoning with it, and it feels like the most internal monologue song that we have on this record.
That one is very much an internal monologue song, and also like a case of we were talking about the vocals. I really like the vocals on this one, especially when he says, the titular because love is not enough. Really, just there's a lot of sincerity in that comes through.
And after that, we have my favorite song, Every Day is Exactly the Same, which is an eternal barn burner. I would place this amongst like a bunch of my favorite songs from the previous records. Just it feels that drop feels so instantly iconic, and it does feel like it's one of the album's most successful moments at conveying what this malaise actually feels like to experience. And after that, we get the title track with Teeth, which I talked about the drum patterns earlier. The drum pattern on this song is fucking odd. Like this,
Yeah,
I don't
very
know if it's a
very odd.
time signature thing. I don't know if it's a mixing thing. I'm not super technically knowledgeable about this stuff, but this is one of those examples where I'm just like, what is bro doing? But like positive. It's a
Yeah.
very weird fucking song.
Yeah, I was gonna say that you call it with teeth. It's actually called with the teeth. That's because of the way he says
Oh,
it.
because of yeah, like it feels like the TH in both of those words takes on an entire new syllable with the way that it's said. And, this is sort of a classic rock staple of kind of, at least the way I read it, as basically personifying drugs and addiction as a woman, as seduction, as something
Mm.
that is, trying to tempt you, trying to allure you, and ultimately ensnare and destroy you. And the way that the weird musical complexity of this song is just sort of front and center, it's like ensnaring you in a web of music. It's a very odd song that I feel like works really, really well. I think this is maybe the biggest grower on the album for me. Like I didn't remember much about this song before I started listening to this again, and I was like, wow, this is kind of an underrated gem, I would go as far as to say.
Yeah, that one is a lot of fun in terms of just the vibe of it is wild is all I could really add on to that because you pretty much nailed it on the head with the drum patterns, the vocals, everything about it just has this like bizarre but yet entrancing quality to it.
And while this album is certainly a bit more kempt than the things before it, I will say it does sort of follow in the tradition of the last two records, in that I would definitely say the front half of all three of these records is distinctly more linear. It's more like the sequencing of these records makes a lot more logical sense in the way they start out. Like the way Trent tends to structure his records, and this doesn't change, by the way, is that I always think of them spiraling outward. Like he starts in the center and it's focused, and we're going and we're going and we're going, and we get more fringe, more strange, more out there until we're kind of galaxy brain looking at the rest of the album by the end of it. And With Teeth has the least amount of contrast between its first and second halves, but the second half of With Teeth, I think, is distinctly weirder than the more single-oriented first half. It has more moments that kind of slow things down a little bit and relent, and it doesn't necessarily get softer, but it just sort of feels like Trent is flexing his muscles on this part of the record. Not literally, though he was
Kubi.
absolutely shredded at this point. Like dude was wearing t-shirts that were like a size too small and coming out on stage looking like he was just straight roided out. Like dude really like when he got in shape and he stayed that way because he still looks like that,
He
funnily enough.
he transitioned from twink to twonk.
100%. He is the Trent Reznor is the opposite of Twink Death. And
Imagine.
so, like, I don't have as many, like, notable points to say about the second half of the record. Not to say that I think it's less quality than the first half, though I
Mm.
do think it has less truly standout moments. Though I love weirder diversions, like Sunspots, for instance, I think is a really underrated song. I think that lyrically, I actually would say it's one of the strongest on the entire record. And I think that we come to a really satisfying conclusion with the final track right where it belongs. It feels like,
Mm.
this is a point of resolution for Trent. Like, I feel like musically and lyrically, this feels like somebody closing the door on a chapter of their life. It's like,
Yeah.
that was me. This is what I was. I'm not that anymore. I'm moving on. And as a result, I do find it like really emotional. Like it's not as,
It's
it's
kind of
not going
cathartic.
to rip your soul out of your body like hurt will, but it does feel like there is a sense of peace that erupts from this song, I would say.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as like I find it like more satisfying and earnest when it's like because like there's like a lot of songs or like musicians out there who have made like a type of song that in some way is like you'll get through this or whatever, but when it comes from someone like Trent Reznor I feel like it means something a bit more.
It's like he's been through some shit. And it's not like a clean resolve on here either. I think that this is him like really this is why I disagree with the notion that his writing hasn't evolved since the downward spiral or the fragile. It's because the ultimate like conclusion that he comes to is that, the entire world as Trent's previous self saw it was reductive and simplistic and well it wasn't very nuanced and now he feels like he's talking to his past self and is like that world is bullshit and this world that we really live in isn't much better but at least you can see it for what it is now and that honestly I think is like that's clarity that's a moment where I'm like you have definitively arrived at a point where you have marked your stage of evolution. It's why, for its many qualities that I feel like would allow someone to label it as the loathsome transitional album, I don't think With Teeth is a transitional album. I think
Mhm,
With Teeth is an evolution. It just
mhm,
doesn't feel like one because it's not trying something explicitly new. It is a more mature album. It is a more thoughtful album. These things do not inherently make it better. I do like the previous two records more than this, but it has distinct strengths that those albums do not. And I feel like that was taken for granted. This sort of, this nuance was mistaken for either creative stagnation or just wanting to sell out to rock radio, which I listen to this now and I'm like, I simply don't see it. Like I
nah.
guess that like, yeah, it was more successful, but it was merely because it wasn't so fucking weird, guys. Like it was
Yeah.
just it happens to be an album that was designed more for success.
And also, that's kind of also like saying the this is like even like the singles were all completely like just normal songs, I think is discounting for me at least my personal favorite song on here, which is Only. Um
Ooh, what a
I
good pick.
I love this song. It's a case of a song that I've listened to a lot of times because of a thing that I watched that was associated with it. But also I just really love the just unsettling nature of it with the piano and like the I love the fucking synth on this one. It's just so it's so nefarious And the vocals and lyrics on this are really interesting to me because it's like talking about like a losing kind of purpose, and the way that the vocals kind of go, it doesn't even sound like he's singing. It almost sounds like he's like saying a run-on sentence at times that just sort of like morphs into the next word as it continues on. And it has just this very, very bizarre quality. But then when it gets to the there is no you, there is only me, he's just fucking like yelling that shit out of the top of his lungs. Like the only purpose that he has is that he is not whatever the other thing is, which, like in some of the themes that we've kind of talked about so far is kind of interesting. And I don't know. I'm not that smart to necessarily be able to create a particularly like thoughtful reading of it, but I just can't deny what it does for me emotionally. And also, it was used for what is probably the best anime music video I have ever seen, which is a Serial Experiments Lane music video with this song.
On God, Luke, I'm looking that up the moment that this stops because I love me a good like an actually good, well edited AMV.
Yes, I will
My bread and
say,
butter. So one thing I'm gonna mention as sort of the grace note for all of this is that we kind of mentioned how a lot of people in the alternative music sphere, including Trent, are getting more involved in online means of distribution, but not just online means of distribution, but particularly like engaging your fans through online means and kind of creating a different sort of bond and relationship with them. Like a lot of musicians who got their start in the late 2000s did so through venues like MySpace and stuff. Like I'm I don't feel like I'm making this up. I'm fairly certain that's how Taylor Swift originally signed to a label, is that she got like a
hmm,
really big, I don't know if it was explicitly MySpace, but it was something along those lines that like built up her momentum as an artist that eventually ballooned into her success. So like
like, it
this
was
is
definitely
a
YouTube at least.
yeah, it's we're seeing alternative methods of distribution and sort of engagement. But one of the things that Trent did was, there would be like messages and stuff that were on the Nine Inch Nails official website. There would be like codes and stuff that is really gonna presage stuff that's gonna happen for the rollout of year zero. Like lots of ARG stuff, lots of, hidden mysteries and codes and all that stuff. One of the things that was sort of posted on the website leading up to the release of this album was a quote from the writer, actually one of my favorite writers, that being Ursula K. Le Guin, funnily
Wait,
enough. Like,
what?
yeah, right? Like what a
What
what
do
a
you
strange
mean?
thing. It was a passage from the book The Lath of Heaven containing the phrase bleed through, which was, I believe,
Hmm,
the first prototype title of the album, which was eventually changed, of course. But
yeah.
it feels like, when we're at the point where we're like quoting authors like Le Guin, it does again show me that Trent is taking active steps to move to a different place as an artist. Whether or not you get along with the place that he's going is completely up to you. But to me, With Teeth is in its totality like the best case scenario for bouncing back from something bad. This is an album of somebody who has clarity. This is an album that comes from somebody who has their head on their shoulders, who knows what they want to do, knows what they want to sound like, and generally speaking, like knows how to engage the people that they're trying to engage with. And I think that he does an inarguably great job at that. This is an album that feels like slowly as the years go by, its reputation gets like better and better with every single year that passes. It seems to be a record that people like a little bit more. Like it is like just a couple decibel points away from being bolded on Rate Your Music. And I'm like, I hope that happens one day because I do legitimately deserve it. It is a great record in my opinion. It is a great album, a cohesive album, an album that has its lower points, but frankly, I can't really be asked to care that much because the consistency elsewhere is so great that it's just kind of a matter of probability that something has to come in last place, I guess. So to me, this album
True.
gets like a hearty 8 out of 10. I think this is a stellar record. I love going back to it. And it is kind of an album that I've probably listened to a little bit more than some of the previous records because it's easier to listen to. It's about a lot of difficult shit, sure, but you're not getting the dark night of the soul of the downward spiral, and you're not, dealing with the challenging content of the fragile. So this is just an
Yeah.
example of, I feel like, perspectives not being aligned and ultimately time being very kind to something.
Yeah, I was gonna say like either this or Pretty Hate Machine are probably my most listened to Nine Inch Nail album. And honestly, I agree with you in the sense of I could see the reputation of this album getting better and better as it goes. Because, like, I mean, for both of us, it was an introductory point, and I think like the more time goes on, the more that might even still be the case. 2000s kids do your job, God damn it.
Exactly. And it's kind of like we said in the Fragile episode is that after that album, I think there is a solid case to be made that basically every single mainline studio album from Trent and Company eventually is to some extent underrated. And I 100% think that about this album and the next album, as a matter of fact, also, which we are going to cover in the next episode of this. However, we are going to cover some other things alongside it because, technically speaking, Riley and I did a record club back in the day on Year Zero because it is such a unique and interesting chapter in this band's story. And frankly, even though it's an earlier record club, we kind of cracked that open for a lot of what it's worth, but I still want to give my opinion a little bit just to update my thoughts, and I want Luke to be able to speak their piece naturally, so we will be talking about it, but there's a lot of other stuff that we will be talking about as well. And on the horizon, I would like to point out that even though we're in the kind of what is deemed to be the lesser phase of their career, we have not even gotten to the Nine Inch Nails album that I have listened to the most. So
Hmm.
we'll get there eventually. Until next time. Okay.